On September 14, 2001, as the world reeled from the September 11th attacks that had devastated the aviation industry, Australia witnessed the end of an era. Ansett Australia, the nation's second-largest airline and a beloved institution that had carried millions of passengers across the continent for 65 years, ceased operations permanently. The airline's distinctive orange and blue livery would never again grace Australian skies, marking the conclusion of one of the most dramatic corporate collapses in the country's history. Founded by Reginald Ansett in 1936 with a single aircraft and an ambitious dream, the company had grown to become synonymous with Australian aviation, introducing the nation to jet travel and competing fiercely with the government-owned Trans-Australia Airlines for decades. Yet despite its pioneering spirit and deep connection to Australian travelers, Ansett couldn't survive the perfect storm of deregulation, foreign ownership decisions, and the devastating impact of global terrorism on air travel. The Ansett story began in Hamilton, a small Victorian town, where 27-year-old Reginald Ansett purchased his first aircraft, a second-hand Fokker Universal, for £1,700. Ansett had been running a road transport business and saw aviation as the future of passenger transport in Australia's vast landscape. His inaugural flight on February 17, 1936, carried passengers between Hamilton and Melbourne, covering a route that would typically take 4 hours by road in just 45 minutes. This wasn't just a business venture for Ansett. It was a mission to connect Australia's scattered communities through the speed and efficiency of air travel. The young entrepreneur mortgaged his family's property and sold his road transport business to fund this aviation dream, demonstrating the kind of bold risk-taking that would define his company's culture for decades. Within months, Ansett Airways was expanding its route network, adding services to Adelaide and other regional centers, establishing a reputation for reliability and customer service that would become its hallmark. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Ansett transformed from a regional operator into a major national airline, largely through Reg Ansett's aggressive acquisition strategy and keen eye for opportunity. The company absorbed numerous smaller airlines, including Australian National Airways in 1957, a merger that doubled Ansett's size overnight and established it as the primary competitor to the government-owned Trans-Australia Airlines. Ansett pioneered many innovations in Australian aviation, becoming the first airline in the country to introduce pressurized aircraft with the Convair 240 in 1954, allowing for higher altitude flights and greater passenger comfort. The airline also revolutionized Australian travel by introducing the first jet aircraft to the domestic market, the Sud Aviation Caravelle, in 1964, cutting flight times dramatically and ushering in the modern era of air travel. Reg Ansett's philosophy was simple: give passengers what they wanted, when they wanted it, and do it better than anyone else. This approach led to industry-first services like Australia's first frequent flyer program and innovative marketing campaigns that positioned flying as glamorous and accessible to ordinary Australians. The 1970s and 80s represented Ansett's golden age, a period when the airline achieved its greatest success and cultural significance in Australian society. The company expanded beyond aviation into hotels, coach services, and even television, creating a diverse transport and tourism empire that employed over 30,000 people at its peak. Ansett's advertising campaigns during this era became legendary, featuring the slogan, "You should have flown Ansett," and positioning the airline as the choice of discerning travelers who appreciated superior service and attention to detail. The airline's livery became iconic, with its distinctive orange nose cone and blue fuselage making Ansett aircraft instantly recognizable at airports across Australia and internationally. During the 1980s, Ansett captured nearly 50% of the domestic market, running almost neck and neck with the government-owned Australian Airlines in a duopoly that provided stable, profitable operations for both carriers. The airline's engineering division, Ansett Worldwide Aviation Services, became internationally renowned for aircraft maintenance and won contracts with airlines around the globe, adding significant revenue streams beyond passenger operations. However, the seeds of Ansett's eventual destruction were planted in 1990 when the Australian government deregulated the domestic aviation market, ending the protected duopoly that had allowed both Ansett and Australian Airlines to operate profitably for decades. Suddenly, new competitors could enter the market, and the government began preparing to privatize Australian Airlines, which would become Qantas Airways. Reg Ansett, now in his 80s, sold his controlling stake to TNT Limited and News Corporation in a deal worth $400 million, beginning a series of ownership changes that would destabilize the airline. The new owners lacked Reg Ansett's intimate understanding of aviation and made several costly strategic errors, including failed attempts to expand internationally and investments in new aircraft that strained the company's finances. When Qantas Airlines launched in 1991 as Australia's first new major domestic carrier in decades, it sparked a devastating price war that saw airfares plummet and all carriers suffer massive losses. Although Qantas collapsed twice, the damage to industry profitability was severe, and Ansett never fully recovered its financial stability. The situation worsened dramatically in 2000 when News Corporation and TNT sold their stake to Air New Zealand, which paid $896 million for control of Ansett in what would prove to be one of the most disastrous acquisitions in aviation history. Air New Zealand, itself struggling with profitability and ambitious expansion plans, viewed Ansett as a way to create a trans-Tasman aviation powerhouse that could compete with the newly privatized Qantas. However, Air New Zealand's management severely underestimated the challenges facing Ansett and the broader Australian domestic market. The new owners discovered that Ansett's fleet was aging badly and would require massive capital investment to remain competitive, with some aircraft needing immediate replacement at costs running into hundreds of millions of dollars. More critically, Ansett's route network and cost structure were poorly suited to the new deregulated environment, where low-cost carriers like Virgin Blue were beginning to gain market share by offering no-frills service at dramatically lower prices. Air New Zealand's attempts to modernize Ansett and reduce costs led to industrial disputes, service disruptions, and a declining reputation among passengers who had once viewed the airline as a premium choice. The final death spiral began in earnest during 2001 as a combination of external shocks and internal problems pushed both Air New Zealand and Ansett toward bankruptcy. The global economic slowdown reduced business travel demand, while the rise of Virgin Blue and Jetstar intensified competition in the leisure market that had traditionally been Ansett's stronghold. Air New Zealand's own financial position deteriorated rapidly as its international operations lost money and the cost of supporting Ansett drained cash reserves. By mid-2001, it became clear that Air New Zealand could not continue funding Ansett's operations without risking its own survival. The New Zealand government, faced with the potential collapse of its national carrier, intervened to rescue Air New Zealand but explicitly refused to extend support to Ansett Australia. This decision effectively sealed Ansett's fate, as the airline could not survive without continued capital injection from its parent company. The September 11th terrorist attacks delivered the final blow, causing an immediate collapse in air travel demand worldwide and eliminating any possibility of finding alternative financing or buyers for the struggling carrier. When Ansett's administrators announced the immediate cessation of all flights on September 14, 2001, the shock reverberated throughout Australia's business community and traveling public. 16,000 employees lost their jobs overnight, while tens of thousands of passengers found themselves stranded at airports across the country with worthless tickets. The collapse created immediate chaos in Australian aviation, as the remaining carriers struggled to absorb the sudden surge in demand from displaced Ansett passengers. More than 250,000 passengers held advance bookings with Ansett, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in prepaid travel that would never be honored. The airline's frequent flyer members, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, saw their accumulated points become worthless, while corporate travel managers scrambled to rebook business travelers and renegotiate contracts. Ansett's engineering division, which maintained aircraft for airlines worldwide, was forced to ground planes immediately, disrupting operations for international carriers that had relied on the company's technical expertise. The ripple effects extended throughout the Australian tourism industry as hotels, car rental companies, and tour operators that had partnered with Ansett suddenly lost a major source of customers. The human cost of Ansett's collapse was enormous, extending far beyond the immediate job losses to encompass the destruction of career-long relationships and professional expertise built up over decades. Many of Ansett's employees had worked for the company their entire careers, following in the footsteps of parents and grandparents who had also served the airline with fierce loyalty and pride. Pilots who had flown for Ansett for 20 or 30 years found themselves competing with younger aviators for positions with other carriers, often at significantly reduced salaries and seniority. Flight attendants. Ground crew, mechanics, and administrative staff faced similar challenges, with many eventually leaving the aviation industry entirely. The collapse also destroyed retirement savings for thousands of employees whose superannuation funds were heavily invested in Ansett shares, adding financial devastation to the emotional trauma of losing their workplace community. Former employees organized support groups and reunion events, maintaining connections that had been forged during the company's glory days and mourning the loss of what many considered not just a job, but a way of life. The broader Australian community felt the loss as well, as Ansett had been deeply woven into the fabric of national life, sponsoring sporting teams, supporting charities, and serving as a symbol of Australian entrepreneurship and achievement. The investigation into Ansett's collapse revealed a complex web of strategic miscalculations, regulatory failures, and unfortunate timing that transformed a once proud airline into a cautionary tale about the perils of deregulation and foreign ownership. Parliamentary inquiries and court proceedings uncovered evidence that Air New Zealand had acquired Ansett without fully understanding the scale of investment required to modernize the fleet and operations, while regulators had failed to ensure that foreign owners possessed adequate financial resources to support their Australian subsidiaries during difficult periods. The collapse also highlighted the vulnerability of employee entitlements in corporate bankruptcies, leading to legislative changes designed to better protect workers' superannuation and leave payments when companies fail. For the Australian aviation industry, Ansett's demise marked the end of the full-service premium carrier model that had dominated domestic travel for decades, accelerating the shift toward low-cost airlines that prioritized price over service. The consolidation that followed left Qantas as the dominant carrier, fundamentally altering the competitive landscape and reducing choice for consumers who had grown accustomed to the rivalry between Ansett and its government-owned competitor. Today, more than 2 decades after its collapse, Ansett Australia remains a powerful symbol of both achievement and loss in Australian business history. The airline's 65-year journey from a single aircraft in rural Victoria to a major international carrier demonstrates the possibilities that emerge when entrepreneurial vision meets determined execution and favorable market conditions. Yet Ansett's ultimate failure also illustrates how quickly even the most established companies can disappear when faced with structural change, inadequate capital, and strategic missteps by management. The orange and blue livery that once symbolized reliability and service excellence has been replaced in the Australian sky by new carriers that operate under fundamentally different business models, serving passengers who may never have experienced the full-service approach that defined Ansett's golden age. For those who flew with Ansett, worked for the company, or simply watched its aircraft taxi past terminal windows, the airline's memory endures as a reminder of an era when flying was considered special, when service mattered as much as price, and when an Australian entrepreneur's dream could take wing and soar across the continent before ultimately being grounded forever by forces beyond its control.